Hey guys, tonight we're slipping quietly into a place you might not expect to visit in the Middle Ages, a tavern where muddy boots, smoky air, and weak ale made up the rhythm of daily life. We'll wander through the creaking wooden door, sit at a long bench, sticky from years of spilled beer, taste bread gone hard from the week before, and listen to the soft mumble of mercenaries, minstrels, and villagers sharing the same dim firelight. From there, the journey carries us to forgotten recipes, to the story of women who brewed and sold ale, and finally to the contrast of nobles sipping rare wine while peasants made do with cloudy beer. This is history for sleeping, long quiet stories told in the slow voice of a sleepy historian, not made to excite, but to steady your breathing and gently lull you toward rest. If you'd like more of these calm, unhurried nights of boring history for sleep, you can subscribe to Historian Sleepy 365. It helps keep these long, quiet stories coming whenever you need them. So now let the lights dim, settle under your blanket, and let your mind drift. Tonight's tavern door is opening, and you don't need to do anything but listen, slowly, until sleep finds you. You begin your journey on a damp afternoon in the 14th century. It isn't raining, yet the air is thick with moisture, holding everything in suspension. Dark clouds stretch from one horizon to the other, drifting slowly overhead as if listening to each step you take. The sun seems to have vanished early, leaving behind a dim, grey light that spreads across the land. Not quite darkness, but that half-light where you can't tell if the day is ending or the night beginning. You walk along a winding dirt path through the silent countryside. A cold wind slips through the folds of your thick wool cloak, carrying the musty scent of wet grass mixed with the fresh earthiness of fields after harvest. Each step sinks into the sodden ground. Your worn leather boots make a soft, squelching sound in the mud, leaving prints half clear, half blurred on the rutted road. The trees by the roadside stand still, stripped bare by the last winds of autumn. Their dry branches tangle like thin, skeletal arms reaching toward the ashen sky. The last of the leaves drift down in the gusts, landing softly on the damp earth and disappearing into the mix of mud and moss. Far off, the hoarse cry of a crow carries from a lonely mound, deepening the scene's desolation. You pass low-roofed, thatched cottages. A faint light seeps through the small window panes, dulled by dust and cobwebs. Now and then, a thin thread of smoke escapes from a chimney, dissolving slowly into the heavy air, thick with the smell of burning wood. Inside, someone is likely warming their hands by the fire, tending the evening stew, or simply sitting still, waiting for the night to swallow the village. Each time you pass a wooden gate, it creaks in the wind like a whisper from the past. Green moss coats the stone steps. The livestock pens, built hastily from dry branches, stand empty. Only a few strands of straw drift in the air. A stray cat darts across the path and vanishes behind a pile of rotting firewood. The only sounds are your own footsteps, the wind scraping through the fences, and farther still, the slow, deliberate toll of a church bell. You can't tell where it comes from, but it rings steadily, each chime stretching out before melting into the mist. No one greets you, no one calls your name. The whole village feels asleep or in hiding. You keep walking, crossing a small wooden bridge over a narrow stream. The water moves weakly under a layer of green moss and algae. Beside the bridge, a weathered wooden sign bears letters almost worn away. Perhaps once a warning, or simply the name of a place you can no longer read. As night sets in, the cold begins to seep through to your skin. Even with your cloak, each gust snakes down your collar, stinging your spine. Your shoulders ache. Your legs grow heavy. You feel hungry, but not from lack of food, Rather, your body longs for rest, for a place with firelight, a roof, and the sound of voices. At last, through the thick fog and the first flickers of fireflies, you see it. A warm yellow glow spilling from a small window ahead. Not bright, not as warm as you'd imagined, but unmistakably the sign of people, of life, and of an ending to this long road. The tavern emerges as though it has always been part of the village. Dark timber walls, a roof of uneven planks sloping as if about to fall, heavy beams carved by time. A long bench rests against the wall outside, its surface worn into a shallow hollow where someone must have sat for years. An empty barrel lies on its side by the porch, next to a pile of dry straw, a bed for stray cats. Above the door hangs a round wooden sign, painted long ago in colors now faded. Beneath the dust and rain stains, you can still make out the image of a cup and a cluster of grapes, a symbol for the drink brewed and stored here through the passing months. The sign swings with the wind, tapping gently against the wall in a slow, familiar rhythm that seems to greet travelers. You stop at the door. Your hand meets the iron handle, cold as ice. Your palm is damp. You can't tell if from rain or sweat. The thick wooden door bears scratches, metal patches, and rusted hinges, each mark a story from hundreds who have passed through. Before stepping inside, you glance back one last time. The road you came along is now only a band of shadow and fog. No one follows you. No one calls you back. Only the night continues to spread over the village, and the wind still roars across the rooftops. You take a deep breath. The damp air fills your chest, cold but carrying the raw taste of earth and sky. Then gently, you push the door. It opens slowly, groaning like an ancient greeting, and the world inside the medieval tavern begins to unfold before you. The thick wooden door opens slowly, letting out a low, heavy creak, as though it resents being woken from a long sleep. A wave of warmth drifts over your face, carrying the scent of burning wood, the dryness of old sweat, and the faint, deep-set tang of alcohol soaked into the timber walls over many years. Inside, the glow of small oil lamps dances across tables, walls, and ceiling, shaping a flickering world of shadow and reflection. The boards beneath your feet sound with lonely beats. Each step on the worn floor echoes softly among the murmur of conversations, the rasp of low laughter, and the clink of wooden spoons against chipped bowls. You move further in, leaving the cold wind outside as the door closes behind you. The tavern isn't large, the ceiling is low, the pine walls darken to near black by smoke and time. Thick beams run across above, draped with bundles of dried herbs, salted meat, and familiar tools from the countryside. The lamplight throws their shapes upward, where they sway faintly in rhythm with the steady, breathing glow of the flames. You notice a smell both familiar and hard to name. A mingling of wood smoke, ale, human sweat, animal hide, ash, and charred timber. It's thick, warm, not exactly pleasant, but it tells you something important. This place is alive. It has existed and breathed through countless winters alongside the people who filled it. Your eyes move around the room. No one turns to mark your arrival. They carry on their unfinished talks, voices worn and rough, speaking of harvests past, of a missing cow, of rumors from the town beyond the forest. They sit shoulder to shoulder at long, rough oak tables, their surfaces darkened by spilled beer, scarred with cracks and pitted with the small cuts left behind by games and wagers. You take an empty seat at the far end of a table beside a central pillar. When you sit, the bench lets out a soft groan. The wood beneath you is cool, but not unwelcoming. You set your hands on the table's surface, and feel the unexpected smoothness, not from polish, but from years of passing hands, cups and plates, slowly wearing it down. A grey old cat moves silently past your feet. It doesn't look at you, simply gliding by as though part of the building itself. Above you, smoke curls from the large hearth in the corner, carrying tiny glowing specks of ash upward. The fire crackles softly, tapping against the logs in an even rhythm, the tavern's own breathing. At the room's centre, a middle-aged woman, likely the owner, is slowly drying a cup with a worn cloth. Her face is calm, her eyes fixed on no one in particular, yet somehow watching everyone at once. She doesn't need to call out or to ask. She seems to know who needs another drink, who will soon leave, who is drunk, and who has simply come to hide from the cold outside. Across from you sits a man in a dark wool cloak, his beard thick, his elbows braced against the table, his eyes are heavy but not drunk. When your gaze meets his, he nods. No smile, no words, just a nod, enough to acknowledge that you exist here, together, in the same space. You know none of them. They know nothing of you, but the air here does not ask for that. You don't need to be familiar. You need only to be a tired traveller in search of rest and a little warmth on a long winter night. A wooden cup is set before you. No one speaks. The scent of herbal liquor drifts up, not sharp, not strong, but with a trace of bitterness at the tip of the tongue. You take a small sip. Your throat warms and your chest eases. Outside, the wind still howls. But in here, this place feels apart from the world. You lean back against the pillar, eyes half closing. From the next table, the story of a missing cow turns into a tale of ghosts in the forest. The voice telling it is steady, broken now and then by the sound of liquid poured, a knife striking wood, or a small burst of laughter. No one hurries. No one raises their voice. Everything moves as though time itself has been slowed. Footsteps sound above you across the wooden upper floor, perhaps a guest room. A door opens, then shuts. A hinge squeals and then is quiet again. You think of asking for a bed for the night, but there is no rush. Here, there are no clocks, no bells to press the hours forward. Only the quiet movement of an older world where people live, eat, drink, and tell stories under oil-lit lamps. The innkeeper passes by once more, placing another log on the fire. It pops, sending the flames a little higher before settling again. The shadows stretch across the wall, long, uneven, like memories too old to ever leave this place. You sit without much thought, hands around the cup, eyes following the smoke as it drifts slowly upward. Everything is slow. Everything is steady. Somewhere in your mind, you feel you are no longer a stranger. Not because anyone has welcomed you, but because the rhythm here is quietly folding you into itself. A part of the evening, a part of the room, a part of the warmth. You don't remember how long you've been sitting, but it doesn't matter. In this medieval tavern, time is not counted in minutes or hours, but in the stories being told, in the steady breath of the fire, and in the faint tremor of the table beneath your resting arm. And so you remain, silently, as though you have always been here, or will always stay. You begin to notice the taste of food drifting somewhere in the air, hidden within the dense mix of smoke and the scent of people, the edge of burnt bread, a hint of dried herbs from a simmering stew, the light sourness of fermented vinegar, all of it blending into the warm, heavy atmosphere that belongs to the tavern. Not an inviting aroma, but the kind that tells you the place is alive, still cooking, still sharing, still carrying on with the long day. The menu here hasn't changed much in years. It has become part of the fixed rhythm of medieval rural life. Every dish is a quiet reflection of living conditions, of seasons, and of the scarce reserves of a self-sustaining world. On the tables before patrons who have been here longer than you sit blocks of dark bread, hard as stone, baked from coarse, unsifted flour, mixed with bits of barley husk and sometimes fine ash from the hearth to make it go further. No one cuts bread with a knife. They break it by hand. You watch a large man grip a loaf in both hands and snap it unevenly in two, crumbs scattering across the wooden plate. No one picks them up. The second dish is soup, though in truth it's more a thin stew, usually turnips, dried onions, sometimes a few beans or cloves of garlic. If there's meat, it's salted, mostly fat. The broth thickens from being reheated since morning, with barley flour sometimes stirred in to make it heavier. People eat from large wooden spoons, their bowls carved from wood or shaped from earthenware, cracked from years of use. You haven't ordered anything yet when a serving girl passes by. Her hair is tied high, her dress is rough brown cloth, and she carries a wooden tray. Without asking, without looking at you, she sets down a chipped clay mug filled with a cloudy yellow liquid, beer. Not cold, not foaming, likely poured from a large wooden cask kept behind the counter. Here, no one asks what you want. There are no price lists, no written menus. It's understood that anyone who enters only expects the simple things. A bit of stew, a hunk of bread, and a mug of beer. Enough to fill the stomach, enough to sit and stay, enough to quietly forget the cold pressing outside. You lift the mug. The surface feels rough, faintly warm, not from the drink itself, but from years of holding on to the warmth of the last hand that gripped it. The beer carries a faint yeastiness, mild in flavor, but with a lingering taste of roasted barley. Neither good nor bad, simply what people drink because it's what they've always known. You notice the way service works here. No one moves quickly. The serving girls drift quietly between tables, trays in hand, never letting their gaze linger on anyone. They walk with a particular tilt, leaning slightly to avoid bumping chairs, taking short steps to keep from spilling drink, the left hand always steadying the tray whether full or empty. When a bowl of stew is brought, it often comes with a slice of coarse bread, no knives, no napkins. The eater holds the bread, scoops the stew, and uses the bread itself as a spoon. The food is never scalding. The pot is kept just warm enough to last the day without drying. Everything is just enough, warm enough, salted enough, filling enough for someone to stay for hours or to rest here if the night catches them. You see a man asleep at a table, still holding his beer as if afraid someone might take it. A serving girl passes, gently slips the mug from his grip, pushes it farther to the side, then places before him a slice of bread left from earlier. No one complains. No one asks questions. At the far end of the room, near the hearth, a familiar-looking patron, perhaps a merchant, is served something rarer, salted meat roasted on hot stone. The smell of sizzling fat spreads through the air, making a few heads turn. But no one reacts beyond that. They know, tonight, he paid more. Each table has its quiet rules. Those who sit long must order more. Those with money sit closer to the fire. Those who arrive late, or can't pay enough, find seats by the door, colder, damper, and often where the empty barrels are kept. You eat slowly. No one hurries you. No one asks where you came from or where you will go. You aren't hungry, but you eat anyway. Because it is part of the rhythm here. Eat, drink, watch, listen, and let time pass. And you realize something. In this world, a meal isn't only to fill the belly. It is a way of connecting, quietly but enduringly. A mug of beer, a slice of bread, a fleeting glance, each a small story told without words. The hearth keeps burning, its light still casting warm gold on quiet faces. Someone begins a new story, perhaps about a wedding in the next village or a robbery at the forest crossroads. The voice is steady, just loud enough to be heard, not to tell, but to keep the room from falling into complete silence. You take one last sip. The mug is now only half full. Outside, the night is not yet deep, but here, time no longer follows the turn of the clock. It follows the rhythm of pouring beer, of breaking bread, of the even breath of those who know this place too well. You set the mug down. On the dark wood before you is a faint ring left by water long dried, a mark from someone who once sat here, who drank, who ate, who thought in silence. And then you understand you are in the middle of a nameless meal in a room without time, where everything drifts as slowly as the smoke above, and where you could sit forever without needing a reason. In the dim light and close air of the tavern, you slowly realize you are not alone. It is not crowded, yet each person here seems to carry a long, unspoken story, and every face feels like a quiet fragment of a world time has passed by. In the corner, near an old beer cask, a drunk lies slumped in sleep. He's curled sideways over the table, both hands wrapped tightly around a large clay jug, as if afraid someone might take it. His breathing is steady, but deep, with a faint, rasping snore. A tangle of hair and a thick beard nearly hide his whole face. You can see the crust of dried mud clinging to the hem of his coat, and his boots have lost all trace of their original color, now only a patchy, dirt-stained brown. No one pays him any mind, and he disturbs no one. Here, a man asleep from drink is nothing unusual. A serving girl passes, gently sliding the jug a little farther from him, wiping away the ring of spillage on the table, and moving on, no words, no glance. Across the room, a wandering minstrel sits on a three-legged stool, plucking at a crude instrument, perhaps an old lute, the strings slack, the sound faintly buzzing. He doesn't sing clearly, only drifts through a single, monotonous melody, almost endlessly repeating. A few nearby glance his way, not out of interest, but because the music keeps the room from falling entirely into silence. His cloak is worn thin, its fringe in tatters. A wrinkled cloth cap is pulled low over his brow. Before him sits an upturned hat with a few dull copper coins inside. No one adds to them, but no one kicks it away. His presence, like the tune, is simply part of the room. At a table against the wall, 3 mercenaries sit together. Thick leather coats on their backs, short cloaks on their shoulders, boots still caked with mud from the road. Each has a large mug of beer and a small knife stuck point down into the wood before them. They speak in short, low phrases, almost in murmurs. No one laughs, no one holds another's gaze for long. Their exchanges are a nod, a lifted mug, or a single word like "your turn" or "more." You can feel it. The air is not dangerous, but it isn't friendly either. It's an ordered silence. Everyone knows their place in the quiet food chain of this room. The soldiers don't cause trouble, but their eyes keep strangers from drawing near. The minstrel doesn't ask for coins, but his music reminds you he's still there. The drunk sleeps undisturbed because here no one bothers to wake anyone. An old man sits tucked into a corner, a felt cap on his head, eyes closed, hands wrapped around a small cloth bag. No one knows where he came from or when. Each time the serving girl passes, he simply nods and lifts a hand, a sign for a little more hot water. No one asks more than that. There is a woman sitting alone near the door. A heavy cloak hides her body, a scarf pulled low over her head. Her hands grip a stoneware jug, her eyes fixed on the fire. She does not eat, she does not drink. Perhaps she is waiting for someone, perhaps not. No one goes near her, and she offers no invitation. In this room, everyone has a reason to be here, but no one needs to say it. What keeps them is not the beer nor the bread, but a shared sense of belonging, if only for a few hours. A place to set aside a name, a past, and simply sit, listening to the fire and the clink of cups. Outside, the wind still howls. You can feel the wooden walls shift and creak in its grip. But inside, all is still. Sometimes a sneeze breaks the quiet, or a small laugh from a far corner, before both dissolve back into the sound of the wind outside. A child, perhaps the innkeeper's daughter, slips quietly among the tables, carrying a small basket of bread scraps. She says nothing, only nods at each person before gathering a few pieces from one table to another. One of the mercenaries holds out a leftover chunk. She takes it with both hands, nods in thanks, and runs back toward the kitchen. Every gesture is silent. No words of thanks, no praise. You sit there among these nameless, wordless figures, each one a shadow, and you by now are sinking into that same quiet rhythm. No schedule, no ending, only the steady plucking of strings, the weaving of smoke, and the sense that time itself has stopped around you. The voices fade, conversations ebb away like a receding tide, leaving only the faint creak of chairs and the drowsy groans of those who have fallen asleep at the tables. The fire in the hearth has burned low, its light reduced to a faint red glow among the ash. Once again, you feel the cold slipping through the thin wooden seams. But now, your body has grown used to the damp, to the smoke, and to the stillness that belongs to this place. A serving girl moves quietly from table to table, gathering bowls and cups without a sound. Each step is careful, as if she fears waking the nameless dreams scattered across the room. The soft clink of clay against clay is like the chime of a tiny bell in the night. By the hearth, the minstrel has stopped playing. He wraps his instrument in a worn scrap of cloth, picks up the hat with its few coins, and slips out through the back door without a word. You take one last sip of beer, now cooler, more bitter than before. The mingled scents of drink and sweat hang in the still air. No new guests have come in. Those who remain are the ones staying the night, people with nowhere else to go or simply no wish to leave. The drunken man still lies there, but his hands no longer clutch the jug. They hang loosely toward the floor. A cat slips between the table legs, jumps onto the bench, and curls up beside him like a loyal companion. In the corner, the old man has nodded off, his cloth bag still clutched in his hands. The woman near the door has not moved, but her eyes are no longer wide. She is drifting, though not completely asleep. You press your palms to the table, feeling the wood now cool beneath your hands. Your joints give a soft crack as you stand. There's a heaviness in your body, not from the beer, but from the slow rhythm of this place settling into you. You roll your shoulders, turn, and look back at the room one last time. The dim lamps, the figures curled into the shadows, the fading warmth of the fire. You walk toward the door. The iron handle is still ice cold, colder now than when you arrived. As it opens, the night wind sweeps in, reminding you that here, time only paused. Outside, the night moves on. It is dark, so dark you can't see the ground clearly. Only the hearth's glow behind you casts your shadow onto the wet mud. Pulling your cloak close, you step out. The wind cuts at your face, carrying the sharp scent of winter and the distant smell of horse manure. From somewhere in the village, a lone dog barks, then falls silent. There are no street lamps. only the cloud-veiled moon and the worn path leading you home. The inn closes behind you. The hinge gives its final groan, and you are outside again, a traveller in the 14th century, walking the uneven road toward a small hut. The night is dense, not dangerous, not frightening, simply quiet, ancient, and far away. You hear your own steps in the wet mud, the wind threading through a broken fence, the dry leaves spinning in the air. Sounds that need no explanation, as ordinary and unspoken as life itself in the Middle Ages, repetitive, silent, and deeply its own. You walk without hurry. There is nowhere urgent to be. The tavern visit was just one small part of the endless turning of such days, where all you needed was a little light, a place to sit, and a mug of beer to keep the long night at bay. Everything behind you has closed, yet its warmth still lingers. In your cloak, in your hair, in the brief memory you carry. And when you look back one last time, seeing nothing but darkness, you still know the tavern is there. As it has been, as it is now, and as it will always be. Imagine yourself returning to an English village in the late 14th century. Autumn is settling into its slowest days. The muted light of a late morning spreads a soft grey across the thatched roofs and the muddy earth roads. A thin mist drifts between hedgerows woven from dry branches, clinging to the spider webs, still holding tiny drops of water. In that light but persistent chill, fires burn steadily inside small kitchens. There, women, most of them known by no name that history remembers, work at a craft learned from their mothers, and their mothers from theirs, brewing ale. For us today, beer is a leisure drink, a commercial product with brands, labels, and advertisements. But then ale was not just a drink. It was part of life, part of safety. At times, it was the only way to avoid sickness from uncertain water. And so the woman who brewed ale, the one the English knew as the alewife, became a quiet but vital figure. She was not thought of as a business owner, at least not on paper. Society did not see her as a free merchant. She was someone's wife, someone's mother. Yet in truth, she was the one who brewed, measured the grain, watched the quality, and sold to the village. Norfolk then was like many other villages, a narrow, packed-earth main road linking church, market, and tavern. The ale here was nothing like the clear, golden bottled beer we know. It was cloudy, thick, warm, with the unmistakable taste of grain. No carbonation, no chill. It was drunk from wooden jugs, earthen mugs, and sometimes from bowls. The alewife's day began before sunrise. She stirred the embers from the night before, filled a large pot with water, and from sacks of malt, oats, or broken barley began the mash. The smell of damp grain meeting hot water rose into a warmth that was heavy but comforting, mingling with the smoke of burning wood, slipping through door cracks to join the cold, wet air outside. The sound of the great wooden spoon turning through the mash, the hiss and bubble of boiling, the low murmur as she counted measures, all made the rhythm of the day. The villagers knew when her door would open. Children ran past, breathing in that scent. Men heading to the fields stopped for a small jug to drink at their break. Other women came by to trade news, to swap a little bread or eggs for ale. The alewife was not only a brewer, she was a knot in the village's net of exchange and belonging. But the time was not easy for women who traded. Laws in many towns required licenses, levied taxes, and kept strict rules on quality. If ale was found too weak or too costly, the brewer could be fined. And because most brewers were women, they were often dismissed, inspected more harshly, and doubted more quickly. Even so, many kept on. The alewife of Norfolk, the one in this story, was such a woman. We do not know her true name, but the villagers remembered her not for her birth or family, but for the ale itself. They said it warmed in winter, cooled the brow in summer, and never cheated the drinker. In a world where each coin was earned with hard labor, that was worth much. She wore no fine clothes, a thick wool dress, patched and repatched, an apron stained with grain, hands rough from stirring the hot mash and lifting heavy casks. Yet in many eyes she held a quiet power, the power of one who makes what all need, without boasting, without demand. Day after day, smoke rose from her chimney. The scent of young ale drifted to the lane. The knock of cask lids sounded each time she poured. Laughter murmured by her hearth. No one called her a merchant, but all knew that if she were gone for a day, the village would feel less warm. That work, that role, clung to the image of women in medieval life. And among the countless alewives history never named, the woman in Norfolk left a small but lasting mark in the history of beer in Europe. She began as any other country wife in the village, a small house set close to the main dirt road, its walls made from timber frame and clay, its thatched roof steeped in the scent of kitchen smoke. In the early morning she would wrap a cloth around her head, roll up her sleeves, and coax a fire to life with the dry wood stored from the previous season. The copper pot on the hearth would begin to simmer bit by bit. Steam rose from it, carrying the scent of grain through the room, mingling with the warm smell of ash. At first, her ale was only brewed for her family. Her husband carried it to the fields, drinking at midday, to quench his thirst and steady his strength. But then a neighbor visited, was offered a bowl, and drank it down. He nodded, saying the ale was full in taste, smooth, and not costly. One person asked to buy some, then two, and soon, whenever a fresh batch cooled, there came a knock at the door. The quiet house began to collect new sounds, footsteps pressing the earth outside the threshold, low, rolling conversation, the clink of wooden bowls. In the small front room, the long table against the wall often had someone sitting there now, sometimes farmers fresh from the fields, sometimes a traveller resting on his way, sometimes a cluster of carpenters or blacksmiths talking business while drinking slowly. She did not advertise. In those days, no one made signs for a pot of ale at home. News spread only by word of mouth. A man told his wife. The wife told her sister. The sister told a neighbour. Within weeks, the lady's ale had become a familiar phrase. Her real name didn't matter. In memory, the flavour was worth more than any title. Her home became an unspoken gathering place, not a tavern. She lacked the license to hang a sign or sell in large quantity. But not only a private home anymore, for each evening as the firelight wavered in the kitchen, there would be a knock. A bowl of ale for a few coins, or for some bread, or a handful of onions. The trade was simple, quiet, and a little personal. People began to call her the mistress, half in jest, half in truth. In a society where women were still seen as dependent on their husbands, the name carried both recognition and an unspoken admission. She was running something of her own, but moving up did not mean wealth or public honor. Here, it simply meant being known. Her reputation was not written on paper, bound by contracts or protected by law. It lived only in the minds of her neighbors and lasted only so long as the ale kept flowing into their wooden bowls. Day after day, she did the same things: light the fire, measure the grain, stir the pot, watch the heat, draw the ale into casks, scrub the bowls clean. It seemed simple, but it demanded patience and exact care. Too hot a fire and the ale would scorch, too cool and it would turn weak. The water had to be drawn at the right hour of the day before the rain muddied the sauce. The malt had to be dried, but never musty. These small details she knew as surely as her own breath. There were winter nights when snow drifted at the windows and wind hissed through the doorframe, but inside the room was warm and lit. People sat close, hands wrapped around bowls of ale, their rims blurred with steam. Talk wandered from crops and grain prices to far-off matters like rumours from the market town. She spoke little, only pausing to pour, her eyes flicking to the pot to be sure there was enough until the last guest left. And there were summer days when sunlight poured gold across the fields, when sweat darkened the back of a shirt, and her ale was a stopping place for the road-weary. They sat in the shade of the tree by her door, drinking mouthfuls that were warm yet gentle, enough to loosen the grip of thirst. Bit by bit, from an ordinary kitchen, she had made a shared space, not only for drinking, but for connection. And in a place where life was narrow and often harsh, that was something rare. People still did not remember her name. But when they thought of Norfolk and spoke of ale, they remembered the mistress. And in that time, perhaps that was its own quiet kind of glory. Reputation is a double-edged blade, and in the 14th century, its edge was often sharper than one might think. When the Norfolk alewife's brewing was only a few bowls for neighbours and passers-by, no one paid much attention. But when word began to travel farther, when her small house glowed with light and laughter each evening, when strangers from other villages started to find their way to her door, it was no longer just a private matter of the kitchen. In the centre of every market town and larger village, there was a system of rules, not always strict, but strict enough for those in power to profit. Ale and beer could not be sold freely. One needed a license, had to pay taxes, and comply with standards. Rules written not to protect quality, but to secure control. One autumn morning, with mist still lying thick across the fields, a man in a long grey cloak knocked on her door. He was the scribe of the town reeve, carrying a roll of parchment and a seal of red wax. His voice was cold, and even as he read out the clauses she had broken. Selling ale without license. No posted price, no report of brew quantity. The fine was recited slowly, coin by coin, as if to carve it into her memory. She did not argue. In those days, disputing the authorities rarely ended well. From the wooden chest beneath her bed, she took a small pouch, counted each coin, and handed them over. The scribe nodded, turned, and left. The door left ajar behind him, letting in a breath of cold air. After that day, she kept brewing, not to defy, but because it was her livelihood. The brew was like the garden out back. A single day's halt was a day's loss in harvest, and those who drank it were already bound to its taste. But news of the unlicensed brewer soon reached other ears. The second time the Reeves men came to inspect, claiming her ale was thinner than regulations allowed. In truth, there was no such measure written anywhere. It was simply a pretext to demand more payment. She paid again and carried on. So it went, a silent tug-of-war between her and the machinery of local power. Each fine stripped away a little money, and with it, a little of her belief that she could keep this going forever. But stopping meant going back to nothing. Villagers still came, but their looks had changed. Some were uneasy, afraid to be seen as customers of an offender. Others stayed quiet, drinking and leaving without the lingering talk they once enjoyed. There were evenings when the house still glowed, but the air was subdued, only a few scattered at the table, heads bent over their bowls. She began to see that in a place like Norfolk, to rise was not only to be known, it was to be watched. She had never dreamt of wealth, but now even holding on to what she had was becoming its own quiet battle. At times, she thought of applying for a license. But the process was long, costly, and would pass through the hands of men who would rather see her gone unless she paid them a share. She knew they didn't need to forbid her outright, only to make it hard enough that she might give up. The visits became more frequent. They arrived without warning, peering into her casks, jotting down measures, always finding some reason, however small, to fine her. From pot not clean enough to incorrect volume in wooden bowl. She paid, quietly as before, but each time a small crack spread inside her. The trust of those who had once called her the mistress faded, not because her ale had soured, but because people preferred to avoid entanglement. In that world, safety was worth more than loyalty. They still drank ale, but sometimes from elsewhere, from legal cellars without the risk of being drawn into trouble. She held on, but she could feel the change. The hearth still burned, the pot still boiled, but the air in the room was not the same. The bustle had thinned into caution. Laughter had softened into short, broken exchanges. And she herself spoke less, as if conserving her strength for harder days ahead. Her story in this season was like a candle burning in the wind, still alight, but each gust made the flames sway, and anyone watching could not help but wonder when it might go out. Some endings arrive without warning. No storm, no drumbeat, only a morning like any other, after which nothing is ever the same. That day, pale silver light spilled through the clouded panes of the kitchen. The hearth fire still burned, and the smell of malt in the mash filled the house, mingling with the damp of winter. The Norfolk alewife stood where she always had, hand stirring the brew, as she had done 1,000 times before. Outside, the mist lay heavy, swallowing the dirt road into the village. Then, from the far end of the lane, came the sound of hooves, slow, but weighted, as though carrying something heavier than the men who rode. 4 riders in long grey cloaks drew near, followed by 2 empty carts, their wooden frames rattling over ruts. They did not knock. They stepped inside as if the house had always been theirs. The man in front unrolled a large parchment and read aloud, his voice steady without pause, an order to dismantle and confiscate. No trial. No bargaining. She said nothing. In the eyes of a woman who had endured many winters, there was no spark of defiance, only the weariness of someone who had long known this moment would come. They began to clear the place. Full casks were rolled into the yard. The warm, faintly sweet, slightly sour scent of new ale burst into the cold air. Some spilled into the mud, sinking into the ground. The steam from its heat rose briefly, folding into the chill. No one drank. No one saved it. Tables, wooden bowls, copper pots, all were loaded onto the carts. The dry knock of wood against wood, the strain of rope drawn tight, the whine of hinges as doors were lifted from their frames. The kitchen, once so alive in the mornings, now held only the thud of boots, the clatter of objects, and the heavy breath of labor. Villagers watched from a distance, behind fences, from cracks in their own doors. No one stepped forward. Some looked away. Some stared a moment longer but said nothing. Perhaps they feared being drawn in. Perhaps they believed it could not be changed. Or perhaps, after months of hearing of her fines and inspections, they had already braced themselves for this sight. She simply stood in the doorway, hands clasped together. Hands that had grown used to the heat of the brewpot were now cold. A few strands of grey hair were caught by the wind. Her face held no anger now, only acceptance. When they came to take down the sign, the round wooden board with its faded image, a sharp wind passed through. It swayed once, creaking like a last farewell, then was lifted down and set onto the cart. Above the door, only the bare holes of the nails remained. Soon the kitchen was bare, marked only by the round stains on the floor where the great casks had stood. The hearth was cold. Ash lay in a flat, grey layer, untouched. The house echoed now, footsteps sounding as in an empty storehouse. When the last of it was loaded, the man with the parchment gave a final nod. The carts rolled away, leaving deep tracks in the mud and a yard mottled with spilled ale. She did not cry. Perhaps she had cried enough over the years that now there was only a quiet sadness. She stepped into the yard and looked down the long road out of the village. A cold wind slid beneath the rough wool of her dress, reminding her that this winter would be longer than those before. She left the house as one leaves a room they have swept for the last time. She did not look back. Each heavy step pressed into the mud, then was blurred away by the wind. Those who had once sat at her table, laughed in her company, warmed themselves at her fire, were silent now. Some still drank ale in other taverns, places with licenses and no fear of closure. Others never spoke of her again, as if the story had never happened. Perhaps they feared, perhaps they forgot. But for her, the memory remained, not of losing an alehouse, but of losing a part of herself. And so the ending came without noise. It arrived like night, falling over a candle, gentle but final. No statue was ever raised for her. No road bears her name. No plaque reminds passers-by of the time when a woman behind a small brewpot brought warmth to an entire village. Her story was never written into books, never entered into the official records of church or crown. It lived only, fragilely, in the memories of a few, then faded like beer foam at the end of a long evening. Yet her legacy did not vanish entirely. It hides in the small, ordinary details of daily life. In some rural kitchen, a wife still stirs a modest pot of ale with a long wooden spoon, the scent of malt rising to mingle with the damp air of the house. At a humble table, a man lifts a cup of weak beer, never knowing that the recipe, the method, may have been passed down through generations of women like her. When people speak of legacy, they often mean grand things, stone monuments, great names. But in medieval Europe, much of what truly sustained communities was kept alive by the nameless. Ale was one example. In an age when water was not always safe, beer was an everyday drink, not for drunkenness, but for survival. The brewpots of the alewives were not merely commercial goods, they were bonds between people, excuses to gather, talk, and share news. The alewife of Norfolk did not invent beer. She was not the only seller in her village. But she left behind something difficult to measure, the feeling of belonging to a community. Her small house was once a place where farmers stopped after a long day, where craftsmen found a seat and a warm ale. There, stories were told, rumors spread, and friendships began. After she was gone, the little house slowly decayed. The thatch sagged, windows stayed shut, and the smell of hearth smoke no longer drifted into the evening air. Villagers spoke of her less until they hardly spoke of her at all. And yet, years later, when someone lit a fire in their own kitchen and stirred a pot of ale, her legacy stirred quietly back to life, not in name, but in taste, in the warmth that bloomed in the chest after a sip. In the crowded markets of later centuries, when beer stalls grew more common, when brewing slipped into the hands of men and large workshops, there were still old voices that sometimes said, "Long ago in Norfolk, there was a woman who brewed better than anyone." They did not recall her name, but they remembered the way she poured, slow, steady, never filling to the brim, as if leaving a little space for the drinker's story to continue. Her quiet legacy was strong in its very refusal to demand recognition. It needed no documents, no medals. It lived in the collective memory of those who had tasted, who had met her, who had sat in that dim room with the firelight flickering, rain pattering outside the eaves. Whenever a child of Norfolk far from home found a beer that smelled like the old days, a shadow of her returned in their mind. In a way, this is the most enduring kind of legacy, the kind no hammer can shatter, no fire can burn, no law can erase. It does not sit on paper, it rests in experience, in habit, in the quiet moments only the ones who lived them can truly understand. The alewife of Norfolk left without fanfare, but she left behind a way of drinking, a way of brewing, a social space that thousands of taverns later tried to recreate. From a small home, with a copper pot and a wooden spoon, the idea of the alehouse as a gathering place for common folk spread across Europe. Today, when you step into a small pub in the English countryside, the smell of mild ale, the scent of old wood, the low murmur of talk may be the modern echo of that legacy. Though no one knows it, women like her laid the foundations of ordinary beer culture, a culture still alive, though overshadowed by the glare of big breweries and famous brands. Perhaps if you sat quietly in a Norfolk alehouse today, eyes closed, you might hear the slow tread of footsteps, the stir of a spoon in a pot, and the gentle scent of malt curling into the smoke. It would not be her returning. It would be the collective memory of generations whispering to you. And when your beer runs low, the foam fades and the air grows still, you would understand. Legacy is not always held in monuments or written pages. Sometimes it lives in a sip, in a moment of warmth on a cold day, and in the story of a woman no one remembers by name, yet everyone remembers by the taste of her ale. Outside, the night wind sweeps across the Norfolk fields, carrying the smell of earth and damp grass. You leave the pub, walking slowly along the dark road, and realize that though time has erased all visible traces, what she left is still here, in people, in habits, and in the feeling of belonging to somewhere. And in that quiet, her legacy becomes eternal. When you leave the imagined alehouse of Norfolk's alewife, the night wind still carries the faint scent of damp malt and old hearth smoke. But if you were to sit beside another fire in another village on another medieval night, you might be handed drinks entirely unfamiliar. Not the pale gold beer we know, but thick brews, dark and strange, with colours and aromas that would make a modern drinker pause before taking a sip. One of these was ale, brewed with wormwood. The plant grew thick in damp meadows, its grey-green leaves sharp to the nose, its taste bitter enough to make you wince when chewed raw. It wasn't used for pleasure. It was a tool. Wormwood ale was for those who had to stay awake, gate guards through winter nights, shepherds keeping watch over flocks, monks reading psalms in the late hours. They believed its bitterness and strong oils kept the mind sharp, warding off sleep. A swallow of it sent a biting heat across the tongue, sliding down the throat and leaving a long, faintly numbing aftertaste. There is a story, perhaps only a fireside tale, of a watchman on the city walls who, after drinking wormwood ale, claimed he saw a green light moving along the battlements. No one knew if it was the herb's effect or just a way to pass the hours. Either way, the drink was never about merriment. It was about surviving the long cold. Another kind of ale was made only for funerals. Its recipe was never fixed, varying from village to village, but it almost always used roots, often angelica, sometimes burdock, or whatever the local soil offered. The smell was unlike any other drink, faintly sweet, with an earthy depth like a garden after rain, ending with a soft, peppery bite. This funeral ale was not meant to cheer or to banish grief. It was part of the farewell itself. When the coffin was lowered, the head of the household or the village elder would pour the ale into clay cups or drinking horns, passing them from hand to hand. Each person took a sip, holding it in the mouth before swallowing slowly, as if sending a final greeting on its way. Some believed it tied the living to the soul of the departed, if only for a moment. Folk tales mention mourners who claimed to see something after drinking, a figure just at the edge of sight, a whisper calling their name, or a shiver down the spine. Perhaps it was the long fermented herbs working on the senses. Perhaps it was the power of ritual, making the mind alert to every faint sign. Such ales rarely appeared at ordinary tables. They were reserved for specific moments, night watches, holy festivals, funerals, when beer was not just a drink, but part of a larger story bound to belief, custom, and sometimes fear. Most of these recipes have vanished. As brewing became a trade, the odd herbs were dropped for easier flavors and more predictable methods. Wormwood gave way to hops, roots disappeared for being hard to store and hard to tame in taste. The ales of the night watch or the graveside slipped out of daily life, surviving only in scattered lines of old medical texts or in the fading memories of remote villages. Still, if you picture it clearly, a darkened village under the moon, dogs barking far off, a few oil lamps flickering, and you sit with a small circle of people, each holding a cup scented with herbs, you might begin to understand why the old ones felt there was something other in those drinks. Not magic, but the sensation of drinking together in a moment when everyone was thinking of the same thing, life, death, and the thread between them. In the Middle Ages, a drink could be more than thirst's answer. It could be a symbol, a message, a way for a community to remember and pass on what it believed mattered. Wormwood ale, root brewed funeral ale, all were proof of that. And if you close your eyes and imagine bringing such a cup to your lips, its bitterness or its earthy perfume could carry you back to a time when every ale had its own story, and each story was bound to the dead, the living, and to those truths we can now only half grasp. When people speak of medieval drinks, most imagine barley beer or wine. But hidden in the dim wooden kitchens and worn old brewing vats was another world of beverages, one where honey, wild yeast, and inherited secrets shaped flavors we can never fully recreate today. Among them was a rare, more mysterious variation of mead, burnt honey. It began with the simplest of ingredients, honey, but was transformed by fire. The brewer poured it into a heavy iron or copper pot, set over coals or a wood fire, and cooked it for hours. Not a gentle simmer, but heat strong enough to make the honey boil and slowly darken to a deep brown. Just before it crossed into bitterness, the kitchen filled with a heady aroma, sweet but sharp, like caramel kissed by smoke. The brewer had to watch closely. Just a few missed strokes of the spoon, and it would burn beyond saving, hardening into a useless lump. Once the desired color and scent were reached, the burnt honey was mixed with warm water and herbs or spices, depending on the region. Cinnamon, ginger, black pepper in some places, dried orange peel or a pinch of mint in others. But the most important ingredient was the yeast. There was no store-bought yeast in neat little packets. Medieval yeast was alive, a soft, moist culture with a faint, sour smell, kept wrapped in linen or coarse cloth and always kept damp, sometimes for months without replacement. Some families nurtured their yeast for generations, passing it from mother to daughter like an heirloom. It was fed with a mash of malt flour, water, and sometimes fruit or honey. Wild microbes from the air and from the kitchen itself gave it its personality. No two households had the same yeast, each produced its own unique flavor and strength. When the cooled, burnt honey met the living yeast, the magic began. The mixture was poured into wooden casks or earthen jars covered with cloth and stored in a cool, dark place. In the first days, tiny bubbles appeared, the scent sweet with a faint tang drifting through the house. Week by week, the aroma deepened and the taste shifted. Sharp at first, then rounder, smoother, with a long, warming finish. Every region, every family left its own signature on the recipe. Some added pine resin for a resinous edge and longer keeping. Some tossed in dried petals for a lighter fragrance. Some swore by stirring only in one direction, believing it kept the yeast calm and the flavor more harmonious. Such secrets were rarely written down. They lived in memory, in quiet evenings by the hearth, when a mother taught her daughter how to read the bubbles, or to sniff the pot and know it was burnt, just enough. If the keeper of a recipe died before passing it on, the secret vanished forever. There were villages where one family alone was known for the best burnt honey brew. They made it only during the autumn festival, when the year's honey had just been gathered, and served it only to their own community. Strangers, no matter how much they offered, could rarely buy it. Not from pride, but from the belief that its meaning lay in being shared among those who had guarded it. Today, a few craft brewers have tried to revive burnt honey mead from scraps of old notes and trial runs. They quickly discover the hardest part is not the cooking, it is the yeast. Modern air, far removed from that of centuries ago, breeds a different micro-life. The linen cloth, the smoky kitchens, the hands of those long-gone brewers, all shaped the yeast in ways we cannot copy. So when we read of burnt honey and its strange guarded yeasts, we are not just touching a recipe. We are touching a fragment of medieval life, where every element, from raw material to method, was bound to the land and the people. And like so much from that age, it thrived, faded, and left behind a hollow only imagination can fill. If you close your eyes and picture the smell of honey on the edge of burning, mingled with wood smoke, ending with a soft, sour tang on the tongue, you may understand why these secrets were once considered treasures. They didn't just make a drink, they made a memory. And once a memory is lost, its flavor can only be found in the stories carried forward from long ago. In the Middle Ages, drinking was never just about quenching thirst or getting drunk. It was bound up with an entire web of ritual, tradition, and social codes handed down through generations. In every region, in every community, a cup of wine or a mug of ale was more than a beverage. It was a vessel, a bridge between people and between the living and the spiritual world they believed in. In some villages, even those who were old enough to work were not allowed a single sip until they had heard the village elder tell a story. This ritual usually took place during festivals or harvest days. The whole community would gather in the meeting hall or on the village square, where the elder, the oldest man in the village, hair white, beard long, sat on a carved wooden chair, a great bowl of drink before him. He would begin with the old tales of ancestors who crossed mountains and rivers to build the village, of years when the crops failed, but the people stood together, or of long ago victories. Only when the story ended would he lift the bowl, take a sip, and pass it to the youngest present. That first taste was not just permission, it was a blessing, a thread tying them to the village's history. Elsewhere, especially in communities deeply tied to ancestor worship, drinking began with an offering. Before anyone could drink, a portion of the wine would be poured into a bowl or spilled on the ground, an invitation for the ancestors to join. People believed the spirits would watch over them, granting health, good harvests, and protection from misfortune. To drink before the offering was complete was considered disrespectful, even dangerous for the whole community. Other rituals were stranger, more symbolic. In some mountain villages, before drinking, people would tap the rim of their cup or bowl with a wooden stick. They believed every drink had a soul, and that the tap awakened it, inviting it into the celebration. The sharp tock of wood on clay or metal was its reply, a sign the drink was ready to be taken. In some places it was forbidden to drink alone. If you wished to drink, you had to find at least one other person to share the moment. This was seen as a safeguard, that no one should face joy or sorrow alone. Here, drink became a way of sharing burdens, as well as doubling joy. There were also ritualized contests. At festivals, men would sit in a row, each with a brimming cup. When the drums sounded, they could not drink right away. They waited for a signal, perhaps the end of a story, perhaps the last note of a traditional song. The waiting, filled with silence or collective singing, created a charged but warm atmosphere, a kind of mental preparation before savoring the drink's heat. In coastal towns, sailors about to set sail would gather in taverns, each pouring themselves a small glass. But instead of drinking it all, they would tip a little onto the wooden floor. For the sea. It was a way to send a plea for calm waters and a safe return. Some rituals held an almost mystical air. In certain communities where the line between folk belief and formal religion was blurred, drink was blessed before it could be consumed. The leader of the rite, whether shaman or priest, would murmur prayers, sometimes sprinkle holy water, or pass the cup through candle flame. Only then could the people drink, believing it would ward off illness and invite good fortune. For medieval people, such rituals were not excess. They turned drinking into a meaningful event, a moment when everyone felt they belonged to something larger, where each sip carried memory, tradition, and faith. Today, when we drink, we often think only of flavor or effect. But in the dim taverns of the past, or under moonlight in the village square, drinking was bound to something far deeper, something that perhaps only the oldest voices of the village could truly make you feel. Across the long centuries of the Middle Ages, among the wide fields and scattered self-contained villages, brewing was more than a craft. It was a way to hold a community together. People took pride in recipes they believed had been passed down through generations. But alongside that pride came moments when creativity went too far, leaving behind stories that would be whispered for years afterward. Imagine a winter's night when the wind slips through every gap in the doorframe, dogs bark far off, and in the warm kitchen of a timber-walled home, a group of men and women gather around a great cauldron. The air is thick with the smell of herbs, malt, and wood smoke. One man, his face flushed from the heat, stirs the brew with enthusiasm, having just heard of a wild plant said to keep the mind awake, and deciding it was worth adding to the recipe. At first, everyone thought it harmless, a little novelty to make the drink tastier, or at least more interesting. But a few days later, when the drink was poured and the whole village tasted it, they found they couldn't sleep for nights on end. Eyes ringed with dark circles, tempers fraying, children wailing without pause. The winter, already long and harsh, felt even longer under the strange weight of sleeplessness. Another tale came from a village not far away. There, a group of brewers tried fermenting the root of a wild plant they had heard would bring strength. The trouble was the root carried a mild toxin, and when not cooked thoroughly, it caused sudden fevers. One damp spring, nearly half the village fell ill after a celebration feast. The elderly trembled, children lay listless, and in the memory of survivors, it was one of the bleakest springs they had known. The disasters weren't only about health. In one harvest festival, an experimental brew made with honey and wildflowers accidentally produced mild hallucinations. Drinkers claimed to see dancing lights on the walls, or to hear singing voices carried on the wind. At first, it was strange and amusing, but soon it turned uneasy. Some grew paranoid, convinced spirits were toying with them. By the end of the festival, families swore never to touch the drink again, and the recipe was burned in the open square. To modern eyes, the causes are clear: no scientific knowledge, no control over dosage, and too much reliance on hearsay rather than safe testing. But medieval villagers knew nothing of bacteria, toxins, or wild yeasts. They simply tried, and if they failed, it was God's will or punishment from the spirits. After each mishap, the village would gather to discuss what went wrong. Elders and clergy urged a return to proven recipes. Some places banned unknown herbs, untested roots, or new fermentation methods altogether. A few decreed that only trusted alewives, women with years of brewing experience, could prepare drinks for festivals. Even so, curiosity never entirely died. On quiet nights, with only the crackle of the hearth and the wind at the door, some would still experiment in secret. They masked strange smells with familiar spices, hid their fermenting jars under floorboards or in barns. Most of these brews never reached the public. The memory of past tragedies kept them hidden. Over time, many recipes vanished. Not because they weren't tasty, but because the risk was too great. Any written notes, if they existed, were locked away or destroyed. Later generations knew only rumors: the ale that made people laugh all night, or the drink that turned the sky a different color. Sit in a medieval tavern, and an old man might tell you one of these stories, his voice lowering at the memory of a disaster. He would describe the sleepless night when the whole village stood in the yard, staring wide-eyed into the black distance. He'd recall the faint moans from shuttered homes as fever swept through. Then he'd sigh, take a slow sip of pale ale, as if washing away the bitterness that still lingered after all those years. These disasters of creativity, though buried by time, were a reminder that even in the simplicity of the past, people were drawn to the new. And sometimes the price was the peace of an entire community. Yet from those failures came caution, experience, and traditions that kept drink flowing safely through the centuries that followed. Stories of strange beers, recipes both unique and dangerous, gradually became faded memories as Europe entered the new centuries. With the growth of trade, transportation, and especially the tightening grip of town councils and the church, brewing was no longer just the business of a household, a village, or a group of women gathered around a boiling cauldron. It was slowly turning into a regulated trade with clear laws and standards. The earliest beer laws were not written to protect public health in the way we understand today. They were created to ensure that beer, the essential drink of common people, was not watered down excessively, not mixed with cheap ingredients, and most importantly, that the authorities could collect their taxes. In some regions, brewers were required to use only certain ingredients, such as barley, yeast, and hops, completely banning the herbs and roots once used in folk recipes. This brought a certain level of safety. Long winters of sleepless nights caused by an overstimulating brew became rare. Cases of poisoning from undercooked roots dropped sharply. People knew what they were drinking, and beer's flavor became more consistent. In a tavern in Norfolk or an inn along the Rhine, you could take a sip and be sure it wouldn't leave you bedridden for 3 days. But with that safety came the disappearance of the wondrous. No more festivals where a mysterious drink was served only on the full moon. No more secret kitchen gatherings to test a new yeast a grandmother had brought from far away. No more burnt honey mingling with wood smoke, or the light sting from a plant whose name only the locals knew. When larger breweries began to appear, especially in cities, the brewing process became more mechanical and precise. Shining copper vats replaced old iron pots. Temperatures were controlled, yeast was grown in clean environments, and each batch of beer was made exactly the same. This uniformity reassured buyers, but it also made beers taste so familiar there was nothing left to discover. In the countryside, some families kept their old recipes. They brewed only for special occasions, often behind closed doors. They rarely sold to outsiders because taxes and licensing made it risky. Some recipes were even deemed illegal for using ingredients not on the approved list. So they were hidden away in memory or scrawled in faint ink on a scrap of paper tucked into a wooden chest. People back then probably didn't feel they were losing anything. They simply found it more convenient to walk into any tavern and be sure of a familiar flavor. But for the elderly, those who had once sat by the fire sipping the strange warm drink of their youth, it was a quiet loss. They would sigh and say, "Beer doesn't taste like it used to." Not because it was bad, but because it no longer held surprises. This change also altered how people drank. In the past, each drink was an experience tied to community, ritual, and story. Beer from one household differed from another, each region with its own character. Now, with everything standardized, beer drinking gradually became a daily habit, less tied to special moments. People drank to quench thirst, to end a workday, not to take part in a rare event. Larger breweries also brought a strong commercial element. Beer was no longer made just to drink, but to sell, to compete. Advertising, branding, and markets began to shape taste. In some places, beer was shipped in standard barrels hundreds of kilometers away, something impossible for the small, fragile batches of traditional brews that had to be drunk quickly. Even so, somewhere in the clang of copper hammers and the precise weighing of dried hops, there still echoed the presence of small kitchens, where a woman stirred her brew with a wooden spoon, tasted it, and smiled because the flavor was exactly as she wished. That is the part of the heritage no brewery, no matter how modern, can recreate. Today, when you hold a glass of golden beer with fine white foam, it's hard to imagine that there was once a time when beer was cloudy brown, sharp-smelling, and so strange tasting it made the drinker smile or grimace instantly. It's hard to believe there were nights when an entire village stayed awake from a batch of night watch beer, or mornings when people woke dizzy from some unfamiliar root. Those folk recipes, along with their risks, now sleep under the dust of history. And with the arrival of beer laws, that era closed, giving way to a new age. Safer, more stable, but missing the magical, surprising moments that only creative freedom could bring. Within the thick stone walls of the castle, where the winter wind was reduced to a distant breath, the nobles' banquet had already been laid out before the last light of the afternoon faded. Torches lined the long hallways, their flames swaying and casting reflections on the polished stone floors, creating slow, golden ripples like a lazy tide. When you stepped into the great hall, the first thing that caught your eye was not the food, but the perfect balance of the space. At the center stood a long table of dark oak, polished until it reflected the firelight. Heavy silver flagons had been set out, their bodies engraved with intricate patterns of hunting scenes or family crests. Goblets inlaid with gemstones gleamed, each rimmed with a thin band of gold, lined neatly before every seat. There was no haste, no disorder. Everything moved at a slow, deliberate rhythm, as if time within the castle flowed differently from outside. Servants moved silently, their footsteps muffled on the thick carpet. They stood behind each chair, hands lightly clasped at their waists, eyes lowered to the floor. No one spoke unless addressed. They seemed less like separate individuals and more like an inseparable part of the room, present to serve but never to intrude upon their master's conversation. The banquet did not begin with a loud call or a burst of laughter, but with the faintest nod from the host. Only then were the silver flagons tilted, and wine flowed in dark red or golden streams, depending on the type. The sound of it filling the goblets was gentle, like rain falling onto the surface of a lake. Some cups held strong, well-aged wine with a sweet, heady aroma. Others contained a lighter drink, meant for the ladies or for guests unaccustomed to the stronger taste. The dishes appeared in measured sequence. A platter of roasted meat, its skin glistening with fat and dusted with fragrant spices, was set in the center. Vegetables, simmered soft in butter, were served in silver bowls. Slices of white bread, a luxury to common folk, were arranged in tidy rows. Yet what set the banquet apart was not just the food, but the atmosphere surrounding it, a calm, almost meditative quiet. Conversation, if it happened at all, was brief, enough to share an opinion or signal to a servant. No one told loud stories, and there was no clinking of mugs like in the village tavern. Here every gesture was small and measured, the raising and lowering of a cup, the slicing of meat. Even the sound of a knife touching a plate was kept to a faint whisper. Musicians stood in a corner, playing soft melodies on small stringed instruments. Their music was not meant to draw attention, but to serve as a gentle layer of sound beneath the meal. At times, the rustle of silk as someone adjusted their chair or cloak was the loudest sound in the hall. In the warm, golden light of torches and candles, the faces around the table appeared solemn. They had no need to speak much. Their very presence here was a declaration of status. On the table, goblets continued to be refilled without ceremony, as though they could never run dry. From the far side of the room, the banquet resembled a living painting, each figure fixed perfectly in place, fulfilling their role. This silence was not cold but ceremonial, a symbol of authority and control. Unlike the tavern, where laughter and shouts mixed with the thick scent of ale, here silence was the main music, and every other sound merely an accent. When the final course was brought out, often a sweet pastry or fruit preserved in honey, the goblets were raised one last time. No toast, no cheer, just an exchanged glance, a slight nod, and then a small sip. The meal could end without anyone saying farewell, for here presence mattered more than words. And as you left the great hall, the soft echo of footsteps along the corridor blended with the distant wind. The great wooden door closed behind you, sealing within it a still world where goblets glimmered in torchlight, and time passed as slowly as if it might never end. Inside a medieval stone castle where thick walls could hold warmth through the winter, yet also trap every sound, the noble's banquet was prepared hours before the first guest arrived. The great hall stretched wide, its vaulted ceiling so high that the echo of a single footstep could linger, then dissolve into emptiness. Massive, blackened beams as broad as tree trunks crossed the ceiling, their weight both reassuring and ancient. From tall, narrow windows, the faint light of sunset filtered in, turning the fine dust suspended in the air to drifting gold. Candles and oil lamps had been lit early, their wavering glow catching on the cold stone walls and the hanging tapestries embroidered with hunts, feasts, and the crests of old families. Across the grey stone floor, a deep crimson carpet ran the length of the table, leading to the great piece set at the center. The tabletop was a single slab of oak, polished smooth and waxed to a gentle sheen. High-backed chairs, carved with intricate patterns, were spaced with deliberate gaps, enough for servants to pass without disturbing the diners. At the head of the table stood the largest chair, the host's seat, clad in leather and with armrests carved into the faces of lions. From the far end of the corridor came the servants, each carrying something. A snow-white tablecloth pressed without a crease, tall silver flagons polished bright enough to mirror the candlelight, wooden trays draped in cloth bearing loaves of freshly baked bread, and most striking of all, goblets inlaid with gems, each one holding the history of the family who once owned it. Their steps were so soft they could only be felt in the swaying hem of a skirt or the brush of a trouser cuff. No one spoke. They moved to a rhythm drilled hundreds of times, as if the entire banquet were a kind of sacred rite. The table was dressed in order. First, the cool weight of the linen cloth spread across the surface. Then the silver plates, set at exact intervals, as though measured by an invisible ruler. Knives, spoons, and forks, still a sign of refinement in those days, were placed in order of use, handles turned outward. The wine glass was set just above the right-hand side, angled slightly toward the guest's dominant hand. Every detail seemed calculated to remind all present that this was more than a meal. It was a statement of power and order. The wine came before the food. Servants poured thick, glistening streams from the silver flagons into the goblets. Not a drop spilled, not a sound of metal on stone. There was deep red wine from distant regions, rich and warm like embers on the tongue. There was pale white wine, light and cool as a summer morning breeze. And there was sweet mead, golden as melted honey, poured into cups inlaid with mother of pearl, catching the firelight in soft, glowing tones. The guests entered in turn. The men wore long cloaks trimmed with fur, over fine wool or silk tunics fastened with supple leather belts. The women's gowns trailed to the floor, sleeves flowing wide, their hair covered with elaborate veils or headdresses. Jewelry, pearl necklaces, gold earrings, engraved rings, gleamed under the candlelight, never garish, but precise in its elegance. Their faces were composed, their pace unhurried, as though each movement carried the weight of tradition. Once all were seated, quiet conversation began, never loud enough to disturb the stillness that reigned over the hall. In the air lingered the scent of fresh bread, wine, warm wood, and the faint trace of hearth smoke blending into something both luxurious and familiar. The clearest sound came from a musician in the corner, perhaps a lute or wooden flute, playing slowly, not to entertain, but to breathe softly into the rhythm of the room. The first course arrived on large trays, soft goat's cheese, brined olives, and thin slices of smoked meat. Each was placed neatly on a small silver plate before its diner. No one touched their food until the host, seated at the highest place, lifted his glass. At his faint nod, knives and spoons were taken in hand, the quiet scrape of cutlery, the gentle chime of glasses touching. Together they formed a kind of wordless music. Throughout the meal, the servants moved with practiced ease, almost unseen. They changed plates as each new course appeared, refilled wine when the glass had just begun to empty, swept away fallen crumbs with a motion so discreet it barely existed. There was no clatter, no loud laughter, no disputes. Even private exchanges were spoken low, never spilling into the shared space beyond the two chairs. The main course might be roasted or stewed meat, with vegetables of the season. A golden roast turkey, skin crisp, sat at the center beside a platter of venison, grilled to tenderness and scented with herbs. Root vegetables, turnips, carrots, onions, were simmered until soft in broth, rich with the flavor of the meat. Every dish was arranged for balance of color, like a still life painting. Yet even with such aromas, no one rushed. They took small bites, chewed slowly, letting the taste linger and stretch. The banquet lasted not for the number of dishes, but for its measured pace. Between courses, long silences fell, during which guests simply sipped wine, gazed into the candles, or listened to the quiet music. It was not awkwardness, but ritual, a pause to think, to feel, and to keep the gathering from sliding into the noise of the marketplace. By the time dessert was served, honey cakes, dried fruits, or sugared almonds, the candles had burned lower, the fire in the hearth dimmed. The final sweet wine was poured into small cups. The host lifted his glass, not to toast, but to mark the close of the evening. The guests answered with a sip, then set their cups down, sitting a while longer, in silence. At last, chairs slid back, the whisper of silk as people rose. There were no exuberant farewells, only small bows as they left the hall with the same deliberate grace with which they had entered. The servants began to clear, folding linens, gathering plates, snuffing candles. The great door shut with a soft echo through the emptied space. And so the vast room remained, faint with the scent of wine and bread. The table lay quiet, as if nothing had happened. But those who had sat there knew they had shared something far beyond the act of dining. A moment in which silence itself was the language of power. Once the banquet had settled into its familiar, unhurried rhythm, the special bottles were brought out, not the kind one might see every day, nor even at most noble feasts. These were wines kept in the cellar for decades, hidden away in the darkness of stone vaults where the air stayed cool and steady like a long sleep under watchful care. The host's pride was a French vintage aged for 20 years. It came from a distant estate where the vines grew in limestone-rich soil, catching just enough summer sun before enduring the heavy autumn fog. The grapes were small, thick-skinned, hand-picked one by one, and pressed slowly to preserve their full character. The wine then rested in oak casks, year after year, its flavor deepening and rounding out like an old story that only the patient could hear to the end. At the host's signal, the servant brought the bottle forward. The cork was drawn with deliberate slowness, releasing a soft sound like a sigh. The wine was poured into a glass decanter to breathe, a ritual never skipped, for a long-aged wine needed that brief time to open all its layers of aroma. In the glass, it shone dark red like garnet, glowing even warmer in the candlelight. Tilting it slightly was enough to release the scent of ripe fruit, oak, and the faint earthiness of damp soil after rain. But it was not only old vintages that were honored. Some red wines were opened only under a full moon, a tradition born of the belief that moonlight in its fullness brought perfect balance between light and dark, and that wine drunk on such a night would connect with the bloodline. This was not poetic flourish. Many families believed that drinking under the full moon was a way to receive the strength and wisdom of their ancestors. On such nights, the table might be set near a great window or in a courtyard, where moonlight could fall directly into the wineglass, casting a silver halo into the deep red liquid. As the glass was raised, the light seemed to shift, as though the moon itself were floating within each drop. The eldest at the table would speak a few short words, not quite a toast, more like a prayer, and then all would take a sip together. There were other wines whose role was more ceremonial than for simple enjoyment. One was a white wine infused with elderflower, reserved solely for family weddings. It was opened immediately after the marriage vows were spoken, marking the union of two bloodlines. The elderflower's aroma was delicate, like the breath of early summer wind, weaving through the gentle acidity of the wine to create a sense both pure and fragile. Rarer still was the mead kept in small earthen jars, buried underground for years. When opened, it gleamed amber gold, rich and sweet on the nose, without being cloying. It was believed that drinking this on the winter solstice would bring good fortune and a bountiful harvest, making it a treasured drink that appeared only once each year. A noble's wine cellar in those days was a trove. Along the stone walls, wooden racks were stacked with bottles and jars, each marked with its own sign, sometimes the family crest, sometimes a wax seal impressed with the master's handprint. Few were allowed inside, only trusted servants or the lord himself could choose a bottle for the table. And though these wines were guarded like treasures, the act of drinking them was done in utter quiet. There was no cheering or clashing of cups as in a common tavern. Each sip was taken slowly, as if the drinker were listening to a story told in flavor. Sometimes just a glance exchanged between two people was enough to share the experience, no words required. The rarity of these wines lay not only in their taste or material worth, but in the layers of culture and spirit wrapped around them. Each bottle was a fragment of family history, proof of endurance and authority. To drink was not merely to savor, but to remember the past, to connect with the dead, and to affirm that the flow of blood and tradition still ran unbroken. And when the banquet drew to a close, the special bottles were carried back to the cellar, left once more in the cold dark to wait for the right moment to be awakened. Like memories, they slept, but they were never lost. In the world of the medieval nobility, drinking wine was never simply about quenching thirst or savoring flavor. It was a chain of rituals preserved and guarded through generations, so strict that even the smallest misstep could be taken as an act of disrespect, even insult. A glass of wine, for example, was never poured full. The rule was exactly 2/3, no more, no less. That amount allowed the drinker to swirl the wine, to study its color, and to breathe in the aroma rising from the liquid. It also left space for the wine to breathe, for its fragrance to unfurl, and ensured that one never had to bend too deeply, a movement considered lacking in elegance. At a banquet, there would be no clinking of glasses as in a crowded tavern. Instead, when wishing to honor someone or to offer congratulations, one simply raised the glass to eye level and met the other's gaze. A look, held long enough and sincerely enough, carried more meaning than any spoken "to your health." Sometimes that look was accompanied by a slow nod, like a full stop, ending an unspoken greeting. When the wine was finished, the glass was set gently onto a silk cloth placed in front of each guest. The cloth was often white or ivory, its edge embroidered with delicate motifs, perhaps the family crest, perhaps vine leaves or curling tendrils. Placing the glass directly on the wooden table, no matter how clean, was considered careless, a sign of disrespect toward the host. Another important rule: if invited to drink, you were almost never free to refuse. To turn down a glass poured and offered by hand was to refuse the goodwill of the host, and in noble society that was little different from rejecting the honor of their family. Even if one did not wish to drink, it was necessary to touch the lips to the glass, take a small sip, and set it down properly. Only afterward, discreetly, could you draw the glass back toward yourself without drinking further. The ritual extended to the way the glass was held. Fingers were never to touch the rim. Instead, one held the stem or the lower part of the bowl. This was not only to avoid warming the wine with the heat of the hand, but to keep the rim perfectly clear, free of fingerprints, so that candlelight could pass through the liquid undisturbed. Each wine had its own glass and its own manner of serving. An aged red was poured into a wide-mouthed glass, allowing the bouquet to expand more quickly. A light white wine went into a narrower glass to preserve its floral aroma and gentle acidity. Dessert wines, sweet and rich, were served in small glasses, enough for only a few sips, a final sweetness to close the meal. On special occasions, the host might bring out the ceremonial cup, a large vessel of silver or set with gemstones filled and passed around the table. Each person would take a sip, then wipe the rim with a silk cloth before handing it to the next. It was a gesture of connection, an invisible thread linking everyone present. The setting and the sound were also part of the ritual. While drinking, musicians would play soft melodies, often lute or harp, at a volume that did not drown conversation, yet gently filled the silences. The wind slipping through the window, the crackle of logs in the hearth, the faint rustle of silk as guests shifted, all merged into a quiet backdrop, making each sip feel deeper, more resonant. These noble drinking customs were not easily grasped by newcomers. Some, unaccustomed to such stillness and measured pace, might feel uneasy. They might, without thinking, fill a glass to the brim or drink too quickly. In such moments, no one shouted or scolded outright, but a few glances, a faint, knowing smile, were enough to make the offender realize they had fallen out of step. Strangely, it was this slowness that stretched the experience of drinking. A single glass could last half an hour, taken in small sips between long intervals of conversation or quiet. And when the final glass was set down upon the silk cloth, one did not feel drunk, but rather as though a small, ancient rite had been completed, where past and present met in each drop of wine. These rituals, however elaborate, held the power to maintain order and dignity in the noble sphere. They reminded everyone that here, wine was not for forgetting the world, but for remembering exactly where one stood, to whom one belonged, and what one had inherited. Beyond the high stone walls of grand castles, the world of the peasantry moved on, slow, repetitive, steady as the furrows of a well-worn field. They knew that no matter how many seasons passed, there would never be a day when they were invited into the great hall to sit beneath embroidered tapestries and raise a silver cup. To them, the castle was only a distant shape, near enough to see yet so far that touching it was impossible. Peasants were never permitted inside to take part in the nobles' wine feasts. Even on great festival days, when the gates stood open, they were kept to the outer courtyard, where rough wooden tables were set out for the villagers. But there was no aged wine there, no jeweled goblets. Only thin beer poured into chipped clay mugs, their glaze worn away, sometimes still marked with stains from earlier gatherings. For the servants within the castle, that divide was even sharper. They handled wine every day, but only as pourers, carriers, polishers of glasses after the master had finished. They could breathe in the deep aroma of a freshly opened red, hear the gentle stream as it flowed from a silver flagon into crystal, yet never let a single drop pass their lips. The rule was firm, ingrained in every gesture they made. Only on rare occasions, when the master was in especially good humor, or when a noble guest wished to be generous, were servants allowed to taste. And taste did not mean a sip for pleasure, but merely touching the wine to the lips to be sure it was unspoiled and untainted. After that, they would set the glass down, step back, and let the true drinker take it. Sometimes, as a gift rather than a duty, they were given a few drops, poured into a small cup, or even onto a silver spoon. Just enough to sense it, never enough to feel its warmth. To them, those drops felt like a blessing. Some servants carried that memory all their lives, recalling the flavor, the color, glinting in candlelight. They could tell the story again and again to friends or children, as proof that they had, if only once, stepped across the invisible line between master and servant. Most of the time, their drink was still the same thin beer, a mix just strong enough to avoid being tasteless, yet too weak to cloud the mind. It was served in clay mugs, often cracked, with chipped rims and bodies scratched from long use. No one cared how it looked, for its sole purpose was to wet a dry throat, to ease the thirst after hours in the fields. On winter evenings, when they glimpsed through a narrow castle window the golden light and the shadow of figures holding wine cups, perhaps more than one peasant wondered what it would feel like. To sit on a velvet-covered chair, to lift a silver cup, to drink, not out of thirst, but for the pleasure of it. But they knew the question had no answer. That was another world, and they did not belong to it. The divide between those who drank and those who never would was not merely a matter of money. It was part of the very structure of society, upheld by law, by custom, by ritual. Drinking wine in the castle was a symbolic act, a way of declaring status and power. And for the common folk, not drinking it was a silent reminder of their place within that order. So, across the generations, the peasants still raised their clay mugs, drinking the pale beer they could make or afford. They never touched silver cups, never inhaled the fragrance of aged wine. Yet in the laughter, the talk, and the warmth of the hearth, they found something else. Not splendor, but the comfort of belonging. The stories have carried you across centuries, from the dim, smoky taverns where common folk gathered to the grand banquet halls of the nobility. From strange, half-forgotten village beer recipes to the deep red wine uncorked only under the full moon. Now, all those images begin to fade like a watercolor painting slowly veiled in mist. You are still there, in a quiet corner of your imagination, like an unseen guest just leaving a feast of the past. The long table draped in red velvet, the shimmer of candlelight, the soft ring of a spoon against a silver goblet, all of it drifts away. You rise, step outside, and the heavy wooden door of the castle closes behind you. Night has settled completely. No more music, no more voices. Only the faint wind weaving through tree branches, the damp scent of earth, and an open sky washed in pale moonlight. You walk slowly down a cobblestone path, each step carrying you out of the story, back into the present. This road does not lead to a medieval village, nor back to a tavern filled with laughter and creaking wood. It leads to somewhere else, to where you truly are. The details of your imagined journey fall away, the smoke from the hearth, the tang of wine on your tongue, the murmurs of conversations in a language long vanished. In their place is the familiar space around you. You feel the warmth of your blanket, the softness of your pillow. No strange sense of coal smoke or sweat, only the clean fabric and a faint, comforting fragrance in the room. No clatter of chairs, no echo of boots on wood, just the safe stillness of where you lie. Outside the window it might be a quiet night or the very first light of morning. But here, time has slowed. The stories of the past have closed their doors, leaving only a gentle space where you need do nothing, think of nothing. Let your body loosen, as though you have just returned from a long journey. Let your eyes close, no longer needing to see the colors of those distant rooms. Let your breath grow slower, deeper, like the steady heartbeat of a house at rest. The people in the stories, the servants smiling for a single drop of wine, the peasants lifting thin beer by the fire, the nobles silent over their feasts, are now only shadows in history's fading memory. They lived, they drank, they shared their moments. Now they rest in the pages of books, in the spoken word, and in the dream you have just walked through. You remain here, in the present, safe, warm, with nothing between you and all that you need. No thought of harvests, no fear of banquet rules, no wandering dark roads in search of an inn. Only you, your steady breathing, your body growing lighter, and the quiet all around. Any sound from beyond is just a faraway echo, unable to stir you from this calm. If you wish, you can let the last of the images dissolve completely. Let your mind drift like a small boat without oars, carried by gentle waters. Slowly, softly, steadily. There is nothing left to remember, nothing left to hold on to, only this moment as you close your eyes, letting the tales of the Middle Ages drift away and sinking into a deep, peaceful sleep. And that's where we'll leave it tonight. From the muddy taverns of the countryside to the silver cups of the nobility, the story of medieval drinking is not just about ale and wine. It's about survival, ritual, and memory. Thank you for spending this quiet time with historian Sleepy 365. If this helped you rest, you can always come back for more long, calm storytelling, the kind of boring history for sleep that makes drifting off easier. For now, let your eyes close, let the echoes of the past fade, and drift gently into sleep. Good night.